From the palace of the Roman governor, the Praetorium, I'd like to take you now to the main structure, the most magnificent one, built by King Herod, the Hippodrome. Come with me. Welcome to King Herod's Hippodrome. What is a hippodrome? Well, we already had a theater for plays, for entertainment, light entertainment. The heavy-duty entertainment, the real stuff, would be in the hippodrome. Horse races. Hippos, horse. Dromeo in Greek, iron. So, horse races. These installations are huge. Theaters are quite small, relatively. Hippodromes are huge because horses and carriages are basically driving around the central area. So they're coming basically from over there, about 250 meters away, sometimes 400 meters. And they basically ride on the left-hand side and then turn around this point. This is why it is curved here. And then backwards, several times, several rounds, until the victory is achieved by someone. The spectators are cheering all around us. You can see the spectators' seats. They are preserved mostly on the eastern side, but much less on the western side. There's a reason for that, and I'll explain that in a moment. But let's see first, what is the typical shape of a hippodrome, and what really happens here in this unique hippodrome. It is unique in the world. You'll understand in a moment why. Come with me, let's go to the shade. Now, whilst we go, you can actually see that there's a wooden structure. On top of the wooden structure, we believe, these are the seats of the VIPs, of the dignitaries of the Roman period. So we're going to sit right underneath them in a rock-cut structure known as sacellum. I'll explain in a moment what a sacellum is. Josephus Flavius, remember, the Jewish historian of the Second Temple period, relates that when Herod built Caesarea, he also built a hippodrome or an amphitheater. That structure was used for horse races, but also for other types of entertainments, such as a special type of games that took place here in Caesarea every 5 years. Now, I'm sure you've all heard about the Olympic Games. They were instituted hundreds of years before the time of King Herod, and they were celebrated every 4 years in Greece and later in the Roman Empire. Also in the time of Herod, by the way. And by the way, King Herod himself even chaired one of the Olympic Games. I think it was the 192 Olympic game. So he was quite aware of this type of games in the classical world, and he wanted to institute something of that kind also here in Caesarea, to celebrate it as a pagan city, as a loyal Roman city. So he instituted the games known as Eisaktion. Eisaktion comes from the word Actium. Actium is a place name in Greece. It is a place where in the year 31 BC, the emperor, later Emperor Augustus, back then he was known as Octavian, he battled with his foe, with his enemy, with his competitor, Mark Antony, and basically defeated him. So the Battle of Actium is the rise of Augustus as an emperor. It is also the rise of Rome as an empire. The Eisaktion Games were dedicated to that decisive battle in 31 BC. But apart from that, as you can see, there were games installed here also in other forms and shapes in later years. For instance, at some point there were gymnastic competitions taking place here. At some point the site was used for other purposes, such as bestiary. Bestiary in Latin means fights between animals, lions against bears, and so on and so forth. It was also used for other purposes, such as fights between gladiators, very popular in the Roman Empire, and even throwing the enemies of the regime to the lions. In this case, the early Christians were sacrificed here. They were thrown to the lions in this specific place. But it doesn't sound plausible once you understand how a hippodrome looks like. Let me show you how things work in a hippodrome, in a typical schematic hippodrome. Okay? These are the cells where the horses begin the race. These are the seats of the spectators. This wall, which you can see right there on the sand, well, it's just the basis of the wall, just the foundations, as the wall itself is no longer here. This wall is the separating wall. It's called the spine, the spina. It's just like a spine of the structure. So the horses would be racing like that and turning around the corner and back and so on. Several rounds, and then the winner is declared. So it's very good for horse races, right? Everyone can see something at some point, regardless of whether you look from here, here, or here. At one point you see some of the event. But it's very different from a gladiator battle or throwing Christians to the lions. If the crowd is to enjoy the entertainment, so-called entertainment, then there's a problem, you see. It's too long. Someone who sits over here cannot see the two gladiators fighting over here. It's too far, 200 meters away. It's a vague dot over there. So what they had to do is change the feature, change the shape of the installation. How? By shortening it, by building a wall, leaving this part out, hence creating an oval, shorter structure known as an amphitheater. And here you can see very well, you can see the gladiators battle and so on. Obviously, there's another obstacle, right? The spine, the wall. Usually in a Roman installation such as this one, the spine would be built of stone. But if you have a stone wall in the middle and the gladiators are fighting here, people sitting here can't see anything. So what do? We get rid of the spine, we get rid of the wall. But if it's made of stone, it's too much work. So what they did in Caesarea, we believe, they built a wooden spine, easily dismantled, easily rebuilt. So this installation was used for gymnastics, for battles with lions, and also for horse races. But wait a second. If now we shortened it, it's very good for gladiators, but you can't have horse races here, right? If you'd like to have some horse races, you have to get rid of the shortening wall and get back to the original frame, which means now you can use it as a hippodrome. All right, we have found 4 different shortening walls, meaning that throughout its existence, the function of this installation was changed 8 times. Hippodrome, amphitheater, hippodrome, amphitheater, hippodrome, amphitheater, and so on and so forth. Amazing. Now, this is a place where people came to die. A gladiator fighting here. But sometimes they just came here to compete. And when one comes to compete with his opponents, with his colleagues, as a gladiator or as an athlete, he'd probably want to win. So you do your best, you practice, but it's always wise to ask for the help of the gods. Remember, this is a very religious society. Yes, they're pagans, but they're very keen. They take it seriously. So in a Roman installation such as this, and we have it in other places in the country too, what we find usually is a shrine such as this one. This little shrine is a small temple. Several altars were found here. Inscriptions, decorations showing gods. This is the place where the athlete or gladiator would come to pray for his God's help before getting into the arena and fighting for his life. Interestingly enough, this was true in the time of the Roman pagans, but later, in the Byzantine period, this little pagan shrine was converted into a Christian chapel dedicated for the saints, to the saints. It's quite amazing, I believe, because you see, Cesarea isn't frozen in time in antiquity. There's no one Cesarea. You look at the hippodrome, it turns into something else 8 times and backwards. You come to the shrine, which is a pagan shrine, and then it changes and it is converted into a Christian place of worship. But there's even more to it, you see. In antiquity, we witness a kind of, I'd say, a method in which the Christian church plays along. The idea is that when the early Christians, the early church, builds another shrine, a church dedicated to Jesus, to Mary, to one of the saints, they would choose very carefully the site. And usually you'll see that they choose a place of pagan worship, which is converted. Not only here. We see this in Bethlehem, in the shrine of the church of the birth of Jesus, the nativity. We see this in Jerusalem, in the church of the death, this crucifixion, this church of the Holy Sepulchre. And we see it in many, many other places. The young Christian church acted wisely. It's very difficult to come to people and tell them, okay guys, from now on, you do not worship Jupiter, you worship the one God and his Son and the Holy Spirit. It's difficult as it is. Why make it difficult? Why not make it easier by choosing the new places of worship to be on the same spot where people are already used to go, their forefathers used to go. The content is different, but the place is the same. So even though this is a tiny, insignificant shrine, I think it symbolizes something very deep in the evolution of young Christianity. If you recall, I said that at one stage, well actually several times, this installation was converted into a place for bestiary, that is, fights between animals. But once you set loose a lion, how can you make sure that he is satisfied with the poor sacrifice, this poor guy in the arena, and that he doesn't decide to chew up on the spectators? You have to protect them somehow. Let me show you how it was done. Follow me. Well, the first thing you see here is that the first row of seats is quite high. Okay, why not use the entire space here for another row for spectators? The reason being to give protection. But this is of course not enough. A lion could easily jump from here and enjoy a fresh meal on the first row here. So that's why we have, we believe, these broken pieces in the seats. You see, this was added at some point later. This was a continuous seat, and then someone broke it, and we see that it happens also up there and over there too, and in many, many other places. In addition, there's another feature, and this is the hole here, pierced on both sides. Now there are several more holes here along the first row. What is the significance of what we see here? Well, we believe that wooden poles were basically put here, attached with ropes to these rings of stone, and attached to them was a very strong net protecting the spectators from the animals. So there are many seats preserved on that side, but as I noted earlier, nothing on the other side. How come? What is the explanation? Well, some scholars believe that there were no seats on the other side to begin with. Maybe here they decided that the view of the sea is a benefit, is a bonus. Why not keep it this way? Some scholars believe that there were seats, but what happened is quite interesting. I'll show you later the harbor built by King Herod. The harbor was built over there, roughly where the Israeli flag can be seen at the far distance. When the harbor was built, a strong wall was built into the sea, creating protection for ships, but also blocking the waves. And these waves coming from Egypt, streams under the sea, bringing sand with them, no longer took the sand with them beyond that point. Where did that sand ended? Well, it ended up here, creating the sandy arena that we can see here. So we believe that at least part of this arena is built on a kind of an island, sedimented, created by the sea because of the creation of the Herodian harbor. But as you'll hear from me later on this tour, the Herodian harbor was out of use already in the 1st century AD, around the year 80, meaning it sank. Once it sank, the waves can go beyond it. And instead of building the shores, now a process of erosion begins, eating up the shores, and the first thing that collapses and is destroyed is the row of seats on the western side of the hippodrome. So presumably this is the explanation for the lack of seats on the other side. We're still in the Cesarea National Park, but we're already outside the hippodrome. We are standing north of the hippodrome, and behind my back you can clearly see a row of vaults carrying a large structure on top. That structure, that building, and these vaults are the infrastructure, that building was a center of the financial administration in Caesarea and in the region of Judea immediately after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 AD by the Romans. So these vaults have function, but that function changed from time to time. Let me take you into one of these vaults, the one on the left, and show you what was the purpose, what was the significance of that vault in the 2nd century under the Roman regime. This vault, which was originally, as you remember, just the part of the foundations carrying the large structure of the administration building, was turned in the 2nd century into a temple, an underground temple, a temple dedicated to Mithras. Who's Mithras, you ask? Well, Mithras is a Persian god. It's not surprising that Persian gods were also worshipped in this country in the Roman period, because the Roman religion was syncretistic. It took gods from different places, different faiths, and one of them is Mithras. Now, Mithras in Persia is a figure which is part of a unique theology. In the Persian Mithraic belief, there are two gods who fight against each other, the good god and the bad one. The bad one, Ahriman, and the good one, Ahura Mazda. They are battling. It's a cosmic battle between evil and good. At one point, Ahriman, the evil god, seemed to overcome, and Ahura Mazda creates the other god, Mithras. Mithras, in his turn, slaughters the holy bull on December 25th. The blood of the holy bull purifies the universe and basically enables the good forces to prevail again. A piece of architecture was found here, as you can see, perhaps the foundations of an altar, which was lit from an opening in the ceiling on a certain day during the year. It's quite usual in Mithraic religion. Now, the vault here served as a Mithraic temple. Another vault, a couple of years later, in the 4th century, was used by Christians as a Christian chapel. So what we see here again is the transition from the polytheistic pagan beliefs of the Second Temple period and the Roman era into the monotheistic beliefs of the Christians in the Byzantine Empire. Welcome to the harbor of Caesarea. Well, I can tell you don't really believe me, right? Because you look around you and you see over there the arches of the new museum of Caesarea, which is also the Acropolis built by King Herod, and I'm going to elaborate on that quite a lot later. Over there you can see some of the restaurants, the touristic attractions, and of course the green platform we're on with the trees, shrubs and the grass all around us. Very peaceful, very nice. It doesn't look like a harbor, but it was the original harbor of Caesarea in the Phoenician era and in the early Herodian era. Now that harbor, the Phoenician harbor, was rather small compared to the later Herodian harbor. It was basically natural, and it was flanked on both sides, in the north and in the south, by natural rock scarp that protected the boats entering the harbor. Obviously, it was also quite shallow, so only smaller boats would be able to reach the point where I'm standing, and right behind me you can see a wall, and this wall is the wall of the wharf, where the goods would be downloaded from the little boats. The boats themselves would be tied up to this round pillar behind me, and there were several of them scattered all around so that they were secured to the wharf. Later, in the time of King Herod, this tiny Phoenician harbor, the natural harbor, was actually enlarged by building longer arms in an artificial manner, so as to create one of the largest harbors in the ancient world. But to explain that, I need to take you now somewhere else where we can see a nice reconstruction or a model of the harbor in the time of King Herod. A moment ago, I was standing on the grassy area, remember, where the original harbor of Caesarea used to be in the Phoenician times and in the early times of King Herod? Well, right behind me, I showed you the museum, the large arches. On top of these arches was the Acropolis, the area of the temple, and the other structures built by King Herod at the top of the city. Where is it? Well, we are now standing on top of it. We are on the Acropolis, facing the sea to the west. And over here we have a magnificent model which was recently installed, and that model shows us again Caesarea at its peak in the time of King Herod. We can see the walls surrounding the city with round towers. We can also see clearly the theater where we started our tour earlier on today. And then we can clearly see the two palaces, the palace of King Herod and the later extension, the palace of the Roman governors. And then we proceeded through the hippodrome, remember, this elongated structure for horse races, which was at times turned into a shorter oval structure, an amphitheater. And then we proceeded up north to this area. I was standing right here. This is the grassy area where the original Phoenician harbor used to be, and we are now standing right here on top of the arches where the museum is, where the original temple used to stand in the time of King Herod. We'll get to the temple later. Meanwhile, let me tell you something about the harbor, which is quite interesting. So the original harbor of Caesarea during the Phoenician period was right here, below the later Herodian sanctuary. That harbor is actually protected very well, naturally, by the rock scarps here and here. King Herod decides that this is not enough. He decides to build the largest ever man-built harbor in the world. Mind you, there were greater harbors in the Roman Empire, but they were all natural ones. This one is mainly an artificial, man-made harbor. That's what's unique in it. The problem is that from this point on, one does not have any bedrock to support a harbor. So King Herod had to build that harbor. How? By building a long stretch here of structure, a wall, and another wall here that will firstly serve as wharves for downloading goods, and secondly will support protection from the wind and the waves, mainly from the south. How does one build such a harbor? You'd say perhaps using stones. Well, that's only part of the answer. This is an ingenious feat of work, and I'd like to tell you how it was done. Firstly, King Herod didn't use stones. Well, not entirely stones, but in many cases he used concrete. He basically used large wooden caissons, kind of rafts, and into these caissons that were shipped to the allocated positions, he poured concrete. When it was heavy enough, it began to sink down into its location a couple of meters below sea level. You'd say, of course, wait a second, concrete couldn't work. It's wet, it won't solidify underwater. But you're wrong. This type of concrete does become solid underwater because it contains ashes from the region of Pozzuoli, today in southern Italy. It's a volcanic ash. Once it is integrated into the concrete, it gives it the feature of being able to be solid, to become solid underwater. So these caissons are being sunk down into position, creating huge wall here. On the other side, he simply puts large stones, quarried in the region, brought, shipped to the location, and sank down into location. In doing so, eventually King Herod gets two lines of walls, parallel walls, but between them there's a huge gap of 10, 15, 20 meters at times. So what about the middle section? Who's going to fill it up? And here comes King Herod's secret partner. His name is Poseidon, the god of sea, or simply Mother Nature. Remember, the Mediterranean sea streams bring lots of sand from the region of Egypt along the seashores of the land of Israel. So once we have a wall here and a wall there, the waves basically bring the sand into the middle section and fill it up. It may take a year or two. We don't have any estimate as to how long would it take, but eventually it would be filled up by sand. Once it is filled up, all they need to do is put large stone slabs to cover it, and you get this 20 to 40 meters wide arm of the wharf. The same is done on the other side. It's a bit more complicated, but I will not get into the details here. And eventually you have an entranceway. Of course, the Mediterranean Sea can be treacherous. One needs to warn ships. One needs to show them the way to the harbor, to the haven. How does one do that? Well, by using lighthouses. And this is the lighthouse of Caesarea. So Caesarea has the largest man-made harbor in the world. Why? Why did King Herod think he needs such a large harbor? What was the purpose of it? What were the goods exported from this harbor? Well, we believe that many goods were exported, such as salt from the Dead Sea. Also, of course, bitumen from the Dead Sea. And also, the most precious commodity in the Middle East at the time, the balsam. Now, these commodities were exported, but is that enough to explain the need for such a huge harbor? We think there's more than meets the eye here. There's something deeper in this harbor. It's not just building the greatest harbor in the world, in the Roman Empire. It's obviously part of the character of King Herod, being the better, the best, the biggest. But it's not the entire story. The Roman Empire needed two things. Remember, I mentioned that earlier on. Panem et circenses. That is bread and entertainment, games. We've seen the games. Where does the bread come from? Where does wheat come from? Alexandria. Ships are not sailing in the Mediterranean during the winter. They have to harbor somewhere. Alexandria is not an option at the time. So the best thing now offered to them by King Herod is this harbor, a winter harbor for maintenance for the winter. When spring comes, merchants who are harboring here will quickly sail towards Alexandria, take the wheat, around 1 million tons per year, and bring it to Rome, fixing the prices. This is a huge profit. That's, we believe, the main reason behind building this huge harbor by King Herod. So it's economy above all. But maybe there's more to it. Remember, it's not just the harbor, it's the city of Caesarea and the harbor of Sebastos. Why build a new city if what we need is just a harbor? And a pagan city, above all, by a Jewish king. Yes, he was an Edomite. His family was converted forcefully by the Hasmoneans. We know that. Yet he was a Jew. At least he considered himself to be a Jew. But he was hated by the Jews. He was ruthless, psychopath. And he was, of course, afraid of his own people. Where would such a king feel comfortable? With his patrons, with the Romans, with the pagans. So maybe this city was designed with the thought of having a kind of a refuge for the king in case of a military revolt against him in Jerusalem. That may explain, of course, many things. And maybe there's more to it. Maybe King Herod, being a faithful heir of the classical way of thinking, wanted to be a city builder. Being a city builder is an achievement that only some kings achieved. King Herod wants to be an oikestes, in Greek, a city founder. In this, he would be in one line with great kings of the past, such as King David, Sennacherib the Assyrian, and many, many others. All these reasons perhaps explain the fact that we have a new city and a new huge harbor attached to it. So we realize how magnificent was the harbor built by King Herod in the 1st century BC. Now let's take a look to the west. Here's the sea. This is Caesarea. Here's the inner harbor. This is the green area. That's the inner harbor from the time of the Phoenicians. Where's King Herod's harbor? The two built arms. They're hundreds of meters long. They simply disappeared. There's nothing we can actually see. Where is it? Under the waves, hidden from the eye. It sank. When did it sink? We now have a date. Already in the 1st century AD, a couple of years after the destruction of the Second Temple, Caesarea lost its harbor. It was a rapid event. How did it happen? What was the cause for that event? Well, some scholars suggest a tsunami, strong waves coming from the sea, a cataclysmic event destroying the harbor and burying it under the waves. Perhaps. Others suggest an earthquake, which caused the surface of the sea under the waves to be lowered down and take down with it the entire built arms of King Herod's harbor. A recent explanation says that it all has to do with liquefaction. What's liquefaction? Well, when Herod built his harbor, the built arms of his harbor, it wasn't built directly on the seabed. It was actually built on several meters of sand. During the first decades of its existence, the sea hits this blockage, this wall built by Herod on a daily basis. The waves strike the basis of the wall. And what happens is that the sand underneath, which is soaked with water, begins to act like liquid. And it simply goes out to the sides, lowering significantly the walls built by King Herod until they eventually disappear about 70 or 80 years after their completion. So we have three competing theories about the disappearance of the harbor built by King Herod. But indeed, that was one of the greatest achievements of this magnificent king. In the middle of the city of Caesarea, right opposite the harbor, in a place where every ship approaching the city could see from afar, stood the Temple of Caesarea. Now, there's a small hill over here, but that's not enough for King Herod. So he builds these arches that you see here, some of them reconstructed, rebuilt, some of them are still in ruins. And on top of that artificial acropolis, he builds the temple. We have found the remains of this temple, which was dedicated to Augustus as a god and to the goddess Roma, the goddess of Rome. That temple was about 46 meters long and 28 meters wide. These are approximately the measurements of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem built by the same King Herod. But this one is for the pagans. Later, that temple was destroyed, and in the Byzantine era, a huge octagonal church was built with 8 sides. To whom was that church dedicated? We have no idea, because none of the Byzantine sources mention its name. But we have a few theories. Let's go to the shade and try to understand to whom was the church dedicated. So, to whom was the Byzantine Church of Caesarea dedicated? Some scholars suggest that it was dedicated to Mary, the mother of Jesus. The reason being mainly the shape, the plan of the church, which is octagonal. We know of other octagonal churches dedicated to Mary in other places, such as, perhaps most famous, the Katisma church placed on the road leading to Bethlehem. This is the place, according to tradition, where Mary rested when she came pregnant to give birth in Bethlehem. This is where she took a rest on the way. There are other examples too. So judging by the plan, maybe it was dedicated to Mary. Other scholars suggest that we should look at the New Testament and see who lived in Caesarea. Perhaps there's some hints we can draw from there. And indeed, we hear, for instance, about a martyr from Caesarea whose name is Procopius. He died, he was one of the first martyrs in times of persecutions before the time of Constantine the Great. He came from Caesarea, he lived in Caesarea, and he became a martyr, so perhaps the inhabitants of Caesarea decided to commemorate him by building a church after him. Another suggestion is that this is the church of Philip. Who's Philip? Well, you'd say, of course, Philip the Apostle. Well, not precisely. It's Philip the Evangelist. These are two different people. Philip the Apostle is one of the apostles, the disciples of Jesus. He has nothing to do with Caesarea. But Philip the Evangelist is a guy who lived in Caesarea. He had 4 daughters who were prophetesses. So basically, he was a devout Christian in the early beginnings of Christianity, and he was one of those who were in charge over the money given to the poor. Maybe his house was somewhere here. Maybe he was commemorated by this church. Another suggestion is that perhaps this church is dedicated to Cornelius. So, who's Cornelius? Cornelius is very well attested in the New Testament. He's actually mentioned in the book of Acts of the Apostles. He's a Roman commander, and according to the story, when Peter was in Jaffa, he has a vision, and in his vision he is instructed to go to Caesarea, to the house of Cornelius. He comes to the house of Cornelius, and of course Cornelius is a pagan, he's a non-believer, he's not even a Jew. Peter resents the entire idea of going to a Gentile, yet he was instructed to do so, so he comes. And he starts to preach at the house of Cornelius, who's a good man, and suddenly something happened that no one anticipated. In the book of Acts chapter 11, verse 44, it says, "While Peter was still speaking those words, the Holy Spirit came on all who heard the message. The circumcised believers who had come with Peter were astonished that the gift of the Holy Spirit had been poured out even on the Gentiles." This event, in my view, is a watershed line in the history of early Christianity. Until that point, there were debates amongst the Christians whether they should address only Jews. The message of redemption, of the Savior coming to redeem, is only for the Jews. Some said no, it's for humanity in general. And here we see that the view that the message of Jesus is addressed at humanity in general prevails. And why? Not because Peter decides so, not because of a discussion between the apostles, because the Holy Spirit decides. It descends on the people who attend the house, Gentiles and Jews as well. At this point, I would say this is the watershed line, because at this point Christianity now turns its face from the Jewish people only to the big world outside. And it is so symbolic that a church dedicated to Cornelius, if this is indeed the case, is built opposite the harbor which leads outside to the west, to the greater world outside the region of Judea. We have reached our final destination. This is the last stop of our tour here in Caesarea. I'm standing here outside the perimeter of the national park, but still in Roman and Byzantine Caesarea. Also, it's still the city of King Herod. The walls of King Herod are located further north. And we can see a nice mosaic floor with an inscription mentioning someone called Iolis. It's a dedication inscription. Such inscriptions were found in many places, but this one's probably unique. This is, by the way, a reconstruction. It's a copy of the original, which was taken out of the site. And here we are located in a site which is probably one of the synagogues of Caesarea. When we speak about synagogues, let's get back in time to the Second Temple period, the end of the Second Temple period. Josephus Flavius tells us that many Jews lived in Caesarea, along with pagans, and there was tension between the two communities. The tension was because the Jews wanted to have their own civil rights, as the pagans do. The problem was that the pagans claimed that the Jews are aliens. They don't belong here. This is a pagan city. The Jews replied, yes, but it was built by a Jewish king, our King Herod. So they went on trial before the emperor, Nero, and he decided that the pagans are right. So there was always a tension between the two communities. Josephus goes on to say that in the year 66, the Jews and the pagans had a dispute over a certain area in Caesarea where the Jewish synagogue, or a Jewish synagogue, was built. That Jewish synagogue was actually the property of a non-Jew, of a pagan, and he refused to sell it to the Jews. And he tried to make life hard for them. At one point, the situation was so bad that the Jews were only left with a narrow corridor, kind of an alley, leading to the synagogue. And one day, a pagan from Caesarea was found at the entrance to the synagogue, sacrificing a bird. For some reason, that enraged the Jews. We don't know what was so irritating for the Jews in the fact that that guy sacrificed a bird at the entrance to the synagogue. But they were enraged, and riots began in Caesarea. Now, the Roman governor, Florus, wasn't in Caesarea at the time. So the Jews leave Caesarea, they flee the city, and they go to meet with Florus. They bribe him to make sure that his judgment is bent towards them, and they ask him to punish the pagans. Florus takes the bribe and punishes the Jews. Why? Because they dared to take the Torah scroll from Caesarea, which was against the rules. They did not consult with him. The riots spread from Caesarea to Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem to the rest of the country. These events of the year 66 AD are the beginning of the great revolt of the Jews against the Romans. A revolt that will end in the destruction of the temple. Where exactly did it happen in Caesarea? Well, here, as I said, we have the remains of a synagogue. How do we know it's a synagogue? Well, the architecture doesn't really help. But there are some interesting finds here. Another mosaic inscription mentioning a guy called Barilos, who was a Jew, who was the archi-synagogos, the head of the synagogue. It was found in the ruins in this area. A capital of a pillar bearing the image of a menorah, perhaps something to do with a synagogue. And more importantly, three broken pieces of an inscription mentioning the 24 families of priests. This is something we find only in a context of a synagogue. So is this the synagogue where it all began? Unfortunately, we have no reason to believe so, because this synagogue is actually from the Byzantine period, hundreds of years after the Great Revolt. But wait a second, don't lose hope. Even though this building is Byzantine, underneath, on a lower level, there are remains of an earlier building from the Second Temple period. Perhaps a monumental building. Could it be a Second Temple period synagogue? Yes, perhaps. We do know that holy sites, sanctuaries, temples, synagogues, churches are usually, if possible, are built on the remains of earlier holy sites. So if we have here a Byzantine Jewish synagogue, perhaps there was also a Second Temple period synagogue underneath. And maybe, just maybe, this is where the Great Revolt against the Romans began. This is where the spark came. In the Byzantine period, here in Caesarea, we have different populations, different peoples, different faiths. It's a cosmopolitan city. Jews, Christians, pagans still. Even Samaritans live in Caesarea. Sometimes they cooperate. Sometimes there are tensions between them. We know, for instance, that in the 3rd century, the leader of the Jewish community was Rabbi Yoshaya. On the other side, on the Christian side, there's Origen, the famous Christian thinker. In the 4th century, we hear about Rabbi Abahu, one of the greatest sages in Caesarea. And on the other side, on the Christian side, it's Eusebius, the father of the church, the first bishop of Caesarea. And sometimes we hear about them cooperating, discussing things together, perhaps studying even, using books from each other's libraries. Caesarea is a cosmopolitan city in the Second Temple period, in the Byzantine period, less later. And in this place, where the story of the Herodian city ends, we also end our tour in Caesarea. We've been able to touch only a small portion of the complicated and interesting story of Caesarea, archaeologically, historically. Hopefully, when you get back to the Holy Land on your next tour, you'll get back here and we'll tour this magnificent site together. See you later, and goodbye.